this video, we are going to learn the basics of contrast and brilliance. Also, we will see the application of these adjustments in different scenarios. So without any further ado, let's get started. Before we begin, this video is a part of a series, and if you haven't watched the previous video, I highly recommend that you do, because this video is linked to that one. Now let's get into what contrast is. Contrast means difference. If you look at the literal meaning of contrast, it means a lot of difference between two or more things. But in the context of photo editing, contrast refers to the difference in brightness between the dark and bright parts of an image. In other words, difference in brightness between the shadows and highlights. Let's understand what I said with an example. So in this example, we have our shadows on the left and our highlights on the right. Let's assume the shadows have 30% brightness and the highlights have 70% brightness. Now if we subtract these two brightness values, we get a difference of 40% brightness. And this 40% difference in brightness is what we refer to as contrast in an image. Now this difference will increase or decrease when we adjust the contrast. For example, if we increase contrast, the dark areas get darker and the bright areas get brighter. As a result, the difference between the dark and bright areas gets increased. And by doing so, the image will have wide range of brightness values, which makes it look more crisp and dramatic. And if we decrease contrast, the dark areas get brighter and the bright areas get darker. As a result, the difference between the dark and bright areas gets decreased. And by doing so, the image will have narrow range of brightness values, which makes it look soft and flat. Now, increasing or decreasing contrast has certain effects on our images. Also, it has some limitations. Let's see them one by one through examples. First off is, increasing the contrast adds three-dimensional feel to the images. For example, in this image, we have a sphere with a white background. As you can see, it looks flat and dull. Also, we cannot see any distinct separation between the subject and the background. It just looks like a circle filled with some color in it. But as I increase the contrast, you can see it adds so much dimension to the sphere and makes it look more three-dimensional. Also, we can notice some distinct separation between the subject and the background. Now it feels like a sphere is floating in the space. So if you have a dull and flat image, you can use contrast to add some 3D feel to it. Now let's look at one more example. Now in this image, let's make the subject look more 3D by adding some contrast. So let's increase the contrast to right about 25. There you go. Here is the before and here is the after. Now the subject as well as the whole image looks more three-dimensional than before. Let's move on to the next one. Increasing or decreasing the contrast affects not only the brightness values, but also the colors present in the image. For example, in this image, as I increase contrast, you can see how the colors are getting more and more saturated, and the whole image has become more vivid and vibrant. And one more important thing to note here is, since contrast affects the colors, it cannot be substituted or replaced by adjusting individual adjustments like shadows and highlights. Now let's see the limitations. If you increase the contrast too much, as it affects both the shadows and highlights, you will lose details in those areas. For example, let's increase the contrast of this image to around 50. Let's have a look at the highlights. Before, after. You can see we are losing details of the clouds in the highlights. Let's look at the shadows. Before, after. We are losing details here too. So if you have an image with dark shadows and bright highlights, you have to keep an eye on them whenever you play with contrast. Also, overdoing the contrast makes your image look cartoony and unnatural. For example, let's increase the contrast of this image all the way up to 100. Now have a look at this mountain right here. Before, after. As you can see, it looks very artificial and cartoony. So for a good editing, we always have to keep the image appear natural. Sometimes we tend to overdo the contrast, which will spoil the whole image in a second. So these are the things you have to keep in mind when you adjust the contrast. Now let's move on to the next adjustment, that is brilliance. Brilliance is almost similar to contrast except for one thing, that is being color neutral, which means it won't affect the colors present in the image. So if you increase brilliance, the dark areas get brighter and the bright areas get darker, which is exactly equivalent to decrease in contrast except for being color neutral. And if you decrease brilliance, the dark areas get darker and the bright areas get brighter. which is exactly equivalent to increase in contrast adjustment except for being color neutral. Since it is a color neutral adjustment, you can substitute this by individually adjusting the shadows and highlights adjustments. Now let's see different scenarios where we can use brilliance. Sometimes when we capture images on bright or sunny days, the subject of the image becomes dark and the background becomes too bright, like this example right here. As you can see, the bright background draws all the attention away from the subject. So in this scenario, we can use brilliance to make the subject pop and darken the background in one single go without affecting any of its colors. So let's increase the brilliance to right about 85. There you go. Here is the before and here is the after. Now the entire image looks so much better. Now let's see where we can use negative brilliance. Let's say you are editing this image and want to increase contrast but without affecting its colors. In this scenario, you can use negative brilliance to do just that. So let's go to brilliance. Let's decrease it to around -20. There you go. Here is the before and here is the after. Now we have increased the contrast without affecting its colors. And this is similar to what we do in Photoshop by adding contrast using curves adjustment layer and changing its blend mode to luminosity. That's it for brilliance and contrast. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to give us a like and also don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell icon for future updates. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.